Tonight on For the Record, we speak with MIDA Chairman and Director of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, Mr. Ashwin Raj. Good evening. It's a pleasure to have you here once again. Among other things, we'd like to discuss the application for constitutional redress that you recently made on Friday afternoon. FBC News ran a story that you're taking this up on behalf of Joshua Lalo Vaki?
Yes.
Yes. Tell us more about that.
Well, good evening, and good evening, Fiji. Thank you for having me on the show. This tragedy and the subsequent constitutional redress application that we filed, and we filed this redress application on 3 grounds. One, that the tragedy that transpired that led to the untimely demise of Joshua constituted a breach of his fundamental human rights. First of all, his right to life. Then, breach of his right in terms of the right to be free from cruel and degrading treatment. 3, this also constituted an interdiction of the rights of arrested and detained persons pursuant to Section 13 of the Constitution. So in a fundamental sense, I mean, this is the first time we're actually taking up a case where we're pushing for an argument that, look, this tragedy is basically a breach of one's fundamental right to life. And all of this has been possible because we've got a very robust Bill of Rights in the Constitution that has enabled the National Human Rights Commission to be able to do this under the law pursuant to Section 45, subsection 4 of the Constitution, as well as the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission Act. The Commission has the powers to institute legal proceedings. So upon exhausting all investigations, we've now come to a point where we're going to proceed, and we're asking a basic question: how did a human being lose his life when he was taken into the custody of the police? There's a talk about the fact that he did not die in police custody but at home. We're asking, well, what transpired? And it's a legitimate question that we should all be asking, because no one should lose their lives at the hands of the police. It should be one of the safest places, right? Because these are custodians of law. I also wish to acknowledge the leadership of the police commissioner, who very quickly got into investigations and proceeded with the files to the office of the DPP, and they've been charged. So one of the things that comes out from this entire sort of tragedy, and this is the lugubrious consolation in all of this, is that despite the various claims made by politicians about the state of human rights in this country, and rule of law, and whether we have independent institutions or not, this is a very, very strong testament to the fact that we have the rule of law in Fiji. We take our Constitution and the Bill of Rights very, very seriously, and the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission has teeth. We're able to dispense with our mandate. Now, we don't make too many public statements about the number of cases we've taken to court, but we have, since I was appointed in 2016, taken quite a few matters to court against the state, as well as private actors within the state, including, general members of the public, in the restitution of their rights. And there are various remedies available. These include the instituting legal proceedings, paying out damages, possible conciliation, and all of that. So you would have noticed that there was a case where a child was taken in by the police, and the courts made a ruling in our favor to say that his basic rights were breached, and the courts ordered that he be paid $25,000. An earlier case, a week before that, which we settled out of court, resulted in somebody whose human rights was violated being paid $40,000. And now we've got this matter. But we're not doing this for money. This is about a very, very principal point, which is that our Constitution has the strongest legal safeguards to protect people's fundamental rights and freedoms. What the National Human Rights Commission is doing is fulfill that constitutional mandate of upholding, protecting, promoting human rights and freedoms.
So talk to us about Mr. Lalovaki's case. all the preliminary work that you did before the application was made to the court. What sort of a legal team have you worked with, the investigations that you've done before that, and whether you proactively took this up or you were approached by Mr. Lolovaki's family?
No, the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission has, under the law, under Section 45(4), the powers to institute proceedings on its own motion. But of course, you know, the National Human Rights Commission carefully monitors these kind of situations where there's been an incident, an allegation of torture and brutality, amongst other forms of violation, and we institute, before we institute proceedings, we have to independently investigate. And we have to investigate to ascertain whether there's any veracity to the allegations that have been made. So in that process, we spoke to family members, we went through medical records and all of that. We spoke to the police as well. And of course, I met with the family. You know, we had to wait this long because we had to be, you know, mindful of the fact that this is a family that was grieving the loss of their son. And you don't want to go in at a time when the family is mourning the untimely demise of their child and get into investigations and all of that. So I thought once the grieving period is over, the family is actually ready, we'll have that conversation. And I said to the mother, you know, who was absolutely inconsolable, any one of us who you know, is in the position where she is, you've lost your child. I mean, I've had to say, look, we will not be able to bring your child back. And it takes enormous amount of courage and strength to be able to stand up and say, look, I'm going to make sure that there is justice done. I'm going to make sure that we hold the perpetrators to account. I'm going to make sure that it doesn't happen to somebody else's child. And I think those are the most important things. And, you know, all of this wouldn't be possible if we did not have a strong constitution with a very, very robust Bill of Rights. All of this wouldn't have been possible if the National Human Rights Commission, you know, decided to look the other way. Right? We don't have a lawyer at the Human Rights Commission. We got a private lawyer to come and do this for us. So for all of the talk that politicians, you know, are doing about, oh, you know, the Human Rights Commission is not independent, it's unable to do its job, it's a puppet of the regime and all of that. This proves yet again that we are independent, we're doing our job.
That's interesting that you mention politicians. In fact, in the next segment when we come back from break, we'd like to talk about the state of human rights in Fiji and how, you know, politicians have discussed it in the past and they're discussing now. But we'll be right back after a break.
Welcome back. Mr. Raj, we were talking about the state of human rights in Fiji, and I'd like to get your views on what you have to say about politicians talking about the state of human rights in Fiji.
So there are people who run commentaries, and that's all they do. For instance, there's been a lot of rhetoric, and there's enormous amount of dissonance between their rhetoric and reality on the ground. The first claim that we do not have any respect for human rights in this country. One of the politicians claimed that the Human Rights Anti-Discrimination Commission is a joke. The reality is that if you look at this case where we filed for a constitutional redress, and I'm telling you this is not the first, we've had other cases, and it's for these people who are making all of this noise to go out and look into the records to see how many cases we've taken to court in the last couple of years. It just goes on to show that for all of their talk, we have strong and independent institution. They talked about, you know, the judiciary not being independent. That's the talk in the courts, on the social media blog sites. But look at the decisions that are coming out of our courts. There's so much conversation prior to the court ruling, you know, in the recent sort of case with the leader of Sudelpa. And then they all went quiet. Because once again, we've shown that the judiciary is independent. The National Human Rights Commission has taken matters to court. Once again, we've shown independence. And mind you, the idea of an independent National Human Rights Commission is not one where you can only say that they're independent because they're taking the state to court. It's anybody who violates human rights, including the private sector. And if you look at our Bill of Rights actually allows us to apply the Bill of Rights both vertically and horizontally. So it is state and private actors within the state. That is something that these people don't talk about. Now, they talk about freedom of expression. You know, they unabashedly lampoon the idea of freedom of expression. Let's talk about hypocrisy. Come the election period, the campaign was all about, we'll make Fiji free again, we'll free our media, we need to be able to speak our mind and have very robust freedom of expression landscape. Well, the moment ordinary citizens started asking deep and critical and meaningful questions about minimum wage, suddenly they got censored out on the social media. So that's the kind of freedom of expression they're looking for. The moment a journalist from this particular organization, a female journalist, started asking critical questions, she was called a bitch, right? Pardon me for saying this on the mainstream media. I think it's for everybody to know that this is the kind of stuff that is going on. So that's the kind of freedom of expression they want. If they are given credence, that's fine. Somebody dares question them. The same democratic norms, by the way, the ones that they unabashedly lampoon, if it is turned on them as a huge assault on democracy, on freedom, and we're going to shut your media down, should we come into power. Yet, they want to make the press more free, they want more independent institutions, they want the rule of law. They talk about how the Human Rights Commission is not Paris Principle compliant. It used to have A status accreditation, is not free, is a puppet of the government. When the National Human Rights Commission speaks out against racism, against hate speeches, against discrimination, they're the first ones to call out that we should resign. The enormous amount of pressure that was put on me when, and this is very curious, when they were already talking about the fact that there was a complaint against the director to FICAC in Parliament when they were debating the ICCPR and a Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Unbeknownst to me, there was commentary on anti-government block sites that there's a complaint against me to FICAC, unbeknownst to me, between these opposition politicians and what was happening in anti-government block sites. Right? These are the people who talk about Paris Principle compliance. Do they even know what Paris Principle means? It means respecting the independence of the National Human Rights Commission, respecting principles of pluralism and all of that. So here they are, on the one hand, espousing to these principles of Paris Principles, which I think, people who write their speeches wrote it for them because they have no idea what this means. And two, unabashedly attacking the National Human Rights Commission while it's independently doing its work. So that's the irony we're looking at. Third, I want to do this because I've had it on my chest for a while. This whole business, if you look at the manifestos about, creating more gender equality because, there's so much violence against women and all of that. How many of them have actually come out and condemned their own political party supporters when they have been absolutely, misogynist? They have said some of the most vile things about women, right? Yo, Shami Lochin, you, right? They took you to town for questioning one of the political party leaders, right? So these are the people who believe in freedom of expression. They believe in women's dignity. They're saying that it's no longer, safe for women to live in Fiji. The violence, against women has seen an unprecedented surge and all of that. Yet, when all of these things happened, when the journalists were attacked, female journalists and all of that, they said nothing. And the only time they come out to issue a statement is when somebody takes them to account. Now, racism, hate speeches, all of that. Have they ever stood up and unequivocally said no to racism, to hate speeches? Have they ever come out and said no to those who incite and vilify communalism? No. What we saw in the context of elections and around campaign and all of that was people targeting Muslims, they targeted Christians, they targeted women, right? They targeted Gujarati community, And if you take a stock of all of it, because we've been receiving all of those complaints since I put an advert out that, you know, people should bring this, all these instances where people are inciting violence, vilifying people on any of the prohibited grounds of discrimination, sowing seeds of hatred. One thing I've learned is that every community has been on the receiving end of it. Let me give you an example. There's one person, I mean, there's a profile, presumably a fake profile of an Ethiopia individual who's saying that I want to see another coup, and when another coup happens, I will rape your wife and your mother. And then there's a profile of an Indo-Fijian who's, you know, attacking this political party and saying some very, very disparaging things, some of the most vile comments, and saying, well, whatever happened to your Jesus Christ now?
Right.
And, you know, so the thing that I want to say is two wrongs don't make it right. And in that context, you had only one political party, right, that actually spoke out against racism, institutionalized racism, you know, intolerance and all of that. The others went absolutely quiet. So for me, these people who occupy an indomitable moral plateau from which they are judging me, right, they need to reflect on those things. And their silence says a lot. None of these people are with me in a police station at 2 in the morning. I am. I can confidently speak about this stuff because it's my job. I do it unapologetically. I get paid for it. But for these people who are running a commentary, I've never seen them in a police station. They're never there when people need them the most. So stop judging. One of the politicians said, well, I don't know Ashwin Raj. We don't recognize him.
Yes.
Who is he to recognize me? Is he God? I'm here to stay. I'm going to do my job until I'm fired from my job. So whether he recognizes me or not my issue. I'm not losing any sleep over it. So as he's running his mouth, and these are like, you know, dogs barking up a tree, there's work going on. So if you look at these constitutional redress cases, you look at the fact that we're speaking out against racism, against misogyny, against homophobia, you know, all of this work around rural and remote communities, once our annual report is out, and it is going to be out very soon, you will see that the Commission has been extremely busy. What we haven't done is each time we have a court case, we don't go around bragging that we've done this,
right,
because we've got work to do.
And in fact, this is something that we'd like to investigate further, the work of the Anti-Discrimination Commission. But all of that right after another break. Welcome back. Mr. Ashwin Raj, we were discussing some of the work that the Commission has done in the past. This election, we sort of discovered how fragile race relations are in the country.
Yes.
But before we start unpacking race, let's talk about secularism.
Yes.
Because there was also a lot of rumors going around about, you know, how Diwali would be taken off as a holiday and replaced with something else. Recently, after Prophet Muhammad's birthday, there was another big hullabaloo about that. So talk to us about secularism.
Yes, and I think that's a very, very important conversation to have, because other than the question around land and security and indigenous rights, which I think we're going to you know, expound on in the next segment, secularism was another contentious issue. And, you know, people went around very, very consciously talking about the fact that because the Constitution has a provision on secularism, we don't have the right to worship our own religion and gods and so on and so forth.
Which is very untrue.
Which is absolutely wrong. I want to say to everybody who's watching this show that the meaning of secularism is that the state, which is the structure, will not have a specific religious orientation. So that means the state is not a Hindu state, the state is not a Christian state, the state is not a Muslim state, the state is not a Buddhist state, or any other religious orientation that you want to. That doesn't mean that all those individuals that, you know, live, labor and languish under the state don't have a religious orientation. You have absolute right to be a Hindu or Muslim or Christian or whoever you are. The state cannot be that, because the state does not belong to any particular individual or community for that matter. The state is there for everybody. So you see that redress application that we talked about. Did we worry that this person was an Ethiopia or a Christian or, you know, female or whatever? No. These rights belong to everybody, and the state has a legal obligation to ensure that people enjoy those fundamental rights and freedoms. So that's the basis on which we apply. So for those people who feel that secularism means that you cannot, worship your own gods and have your own religious orientation and practice various faiths and all of that, that's an absolute lie. My mother is a Muslim, my father is a Hindu. They've never been married. They live together. They profess to their own faith. People have the freedom to be who they want to be. Yet at the same time, the issue is about imposing a certain kind of value on something like the state, which has to look after everybody. So let's go to the Bible. The Tower of Babel, fell because they're trying to impose a single voice on it. Right? Ask yourselves this question, and this is a God-fearing country. I mean, we invoke the name of God in almost everything we do. Bad things happen, we invoke God. Good things happen, we invoke God. Well, not always, because people tend to forget God when good things happen. But ask yourselves if there was a reason why God made sure that all of us look and think and feel differently. Right? Imagine if God wanted all of us to look the same, profess to the same, values and all of that. Right? That's how the Tower of Babel fell, because you tried to impose a single voice. Right? God made us different because diversity is our strength. Secularism is about celebrating that diversity, so that you and I and whoever else there is in that space, with their various faiths and gods and goddesses and whoever they worship, right, can coexist peacefully. Right? The number of countries that are absolutely, war-torn, millions of lives lost in the name of religious feud, is unbelievable. Communalism, religious intolerance, racism is at an unprecedented high in the world today. We in Fiji should count our blessings that we, on the one hand, believe in the values of secularism, that our state is secular. On the other hand, we have very solid constitutional provisions on the right to religious orientation. And the fact that we're able to balance the two is absolutely important. Right? This is why I'm very angry with the lot that are saying, oh, so your political party lost, whatever happened to you, Jesus Christ now. Right. Because for every Hindu who, understandably so feels upset that some sacrilegious acts were, perpetuated on their temples, it equally offends every Christian. When you talk about their Lord Jesus Christ in the way people do. Right? So if your God is precious to you, your faith is precious to you, then it's the same with somebody else. Believe in that. Right? There are people who are spiritual. Right? So they may not have a specific religious orientation. They don't talk about God in a particular form and give God a particular name, but they do believe in the transcendent. Right? That there's spirit in things. Spirit in plants, in water, in the air we breathe, right? That every being is a sentient being, is a spiritual being, right? And so that's how diverse the world is. We don't have to flatten it, right? We don't have to impose a single voice. That's when things collapse. So we have to ask ourselves, and the Christian principle of discernment kicks in. You discern, you think through, why is it that God made us differently? There's a reason why, right? This pluriversality, right, is the strength of who we are as a nation. The fabric of our nation is diverse. The multitude of threads that bring it together, right? So as much as the politicians want to talk about, Muslims taking over, eat okay rights and all of that, we have Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, whole multitude of faiths that we don't talk about because it's convenient to talk about how the Muslim is going to take over the Christians, right? Or we don't want to talk about other races Even though we've got Chinese, we've got Filipino, we've got Africans, we've got, you know, a whole bunch of other, you know, categories of people in this country. It's convenient to talk about Ethiopians and Indo-Fijians. Why? Because there's a particular history. And the politicians are trying to exploit that history. And they like the house divided because that's the capital they need to get to parliament. So you know how far they can look? Only towards their nose. That's the parliament for them.
And in fact, we would like to investigate this further, because race is something that became very prominent towards the election, as the election came closer. And it's important for us to unpack all of these things.
Absolutely.
But all of that in the next segment when we come back from a break. Welcome back. Mr. Raj, let's talk about race now.
Yes.
And one of the things that SODELPA and most of their supporters like to cite is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But talk to us about how compliant Fiji is with this declaration, because in 2007, when it was up for debate at the United Nations General Assembly, Fiji voted in favor of it, in fact going against countries like Australia, New Zealand, US and Canada. So how compliant is Fiji on this? And are indigenous rights under threat, as most people like to say?
Good. So essentially we're talking about 169, right? The provisions in the 169 for ILO. Let me categorically state this. Fiji is one of those proud countries that can come out to the world out there and say, we have a thriving indigenous population. What ILO is about, 169, is about, you know, countries very specifically where the indigenous community is in a state of attrition. They're not politically or demographically preponderant. You look at Fiji, our indigenous community is thriving. They're politically and demographically preponderant. They are in the helm of leadership, you know, in terms of successive governments, in terms of representation, and we ought to be very proud of that. The question that we need to ask is Fiji the same as Australia, New Zealand, you know, Canada, all these other countries? And whether the indigenous communities world over are experiencing the same struggles. Right? And I think that's a very, very legitimate question to ask. Now, I can imagine how, as I'm speaking, somebody must be, you know, online running a commentary about, but he's not even an Ethiopian. But I don't need to be an Ethiopian to do a sober assessment of the fact that our communities are thriving. And that's very, very fundamental. Our Constitution has very, very strong provisions on indigenous rights, on the safety and security of their land, and let's talk about the violence of the law in relation to that. One of the things that came out from all of the debates was the fact that if you look at the 1997 Constitution, right, and you know, people want to go back to the 1997 Constitution and all of that, well, not everybody, but the political detractors, there was permanent alienation of indigenous land through legal means. I mean, it just came out very, very clearly from the interview that Mr. Rambuka did, you know, vis-a-vis that debate with the Honorable Prime Minister. And that's the scary thing, that you can use a legal avenue to disenfranchise and disempower an entire community, because the idea of indigeneity is tied to the question of land. Right? And so in a fundamental sense, we should be cautious of how we blindly want to go back to certain laws. It needs to be read historically against the grain of permanent alienation. You look at Momi Bay and all of that. I mean, that happened when you had all of these institutions in place that people are now lamenting. They're saying, oh, we don't have the 1997 Constitution, which had the whole mechanics in place. We no longer have the GCC and all of that. That was done all in consultation, apparently.
So you've been out on
through the legal avenue, right? And here it is, that the indigenous communities have now lost that land forever. They'll never get it back.
Well, you've been out there and you've spoken to people.
Yes.
You've gone out to communities, and I think off camera you did comment on how in consultation and in conversations, the general feeling is that most of the Ithauke do not want the GCC to come back.
Geraldine, here's the point. When I talk to people, I'm going to be very, very honest about it. What they're interested in is their children enjoying the right to education, all their kids in school, they have proper housing, proper roads, access to clean water, access to medical facilities, a life of dignity, right? A life free of violence, right? And those are the most important things, subsistence rights. And one of the things that I've noticed in terms of the human rights discussion in this country, there is a preferential framing and privileging of civil and political rights over social and economic rights, in terms of subsistence rights, in terms of housing and all of this. These are mutually constitutive, right? That you need to have your civil and political rights to be able to enjoy basic sort of necessities of life, and inversely you also need to have sustenance to be able to materialize civil and political rights. But the way it has been preferentially framed, to be very honest, beyond the political rhetoric, the number of people who have come out to say that an institution like the Great Council of Chiefs was a product of colonialism. This was a construction of colonial governmentality. So let's have a very honest and robust discussion about that institution, right? Somebody said, and this is how racism works, people talked about how, oh, so you have your Sanatan Dharma and you have all of this, why can't we have the GCC? Mind you, the Sanatan Dharma and all these organizations don't have the same kind of political purchase, in terms of the kind of place it has in a constitution like the GCC did. The real question that everybody should be asking is, do these institutions benefit everyone? And this is why I get very, very agitated when people talk about indigenous rights in this country, or for that matter, rights for Indo-Fijians and all of that. Not everybody is the same. Nobody talks about the class differences within these communities, right? So you go to your squatter settlements in Vatwanga and all these, because I grew up in Vatwanga, so I know that. So you go to Bangladesh, you go to Willia Street, you go to Jittu Estate, all of this. In these communities, people coexist across the racial divide and are subjected to poverty. Struggles are pretty much the same, whether it comes to electricity, water, housing, all of that. Access to public transportation, all of that. Nobody cares in there that somebody's a chief, somebody's a commoner. The struggles are pretty much the same. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, what purpose do these institutions serve? And not just what purpose, who do these institutions serve? The same question I'd be asking of any elite Indo-Fijian institution. The same question. So I'm not just targeting Ithauques if somebody thinks I'm a racist or whatever. If you've constructed these elitist institutions for political governance, are they looking after everybody? Right? That's where the state comes in. The state is something, and this is why I went back to secular state and all that, because you see how it's being tied. One, we cannot worship our Lord Jesus Christ. Two, they're taking away our land. Three, basically we need the GCC because the government has forgotten us. The state speaks up for everybody. The state has an obligation. The state provides an abstract structure of redress for everybody. And this is why we need to reevaluate the number of people that are now coming out to say, look, we need to look past these institutions because this is a colonial inheritance, right? And this is 2018. We are still struggling with the vestiges of institutionalized racism. And where did the origins come from? This has got to do with colonialism and the racialized logic of compartmentalization, because to keep a house divided was the only way you could run Fiji. Right? Today we're talking about equality. Today we're not just talking about equality in the superficial sense, we're talking about substantive equality. We're talking about principles of non-discrimination. This is a huge break from the past.
Okay, we'll be right back after a break.
Welcome back. Mr. Raj, this is our final segment for the
Yes.
show, and I can understand that there are many things that you'd like to highlight,
Sure.
but let's just quickly run through a few things. On Friday the 23rd of November, the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission had commended the state on Fiji's accession to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which of course had come into effect on the 16th of November, if I'm correct?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So, I mean, this is a huge step yet again, and it's a testament to the state's continued commitment in strengthening the human rights landscape in Fiji. It places a positive obligation on the state to ensure that it protects fundamental civil and political rights, but also social, economic and cultural rights, which again, you know, brings to fore this whole question around culture. And cultural self-determination, because I know that people, as soon as I started talking about GCC, they would have said, look, but we're unable to practice our language and you know, in the institution of parliament and all of that. Again, democracy demands that if we're going to go down that track, then we must recognize linguistic diversity in its fullest form. Not to privilege one language over another. And this is why you have English as a public language. Does that mean that we don't have the right to speak in our own language, in our own spaces? Of course we do. Look at the Constitution. The Constitution, you know, requires that we learn Itoke and Fiji Hindi in our schools. Right. How did one of the politicians distort this issue? This politician went out, and I take screenshots of everything. My phone's saturated with all of this. So if they open their mouth, I've got evidence. Said, look, but this is not the language of religious instruction and all that, because Fiji Hindi is not what they call Shuddh Hindi. You see, that's the level of communalism that is going on, right? And most of us speak in Fiji Hindi. I mean, how many of us at home and outside go around speaking like a pandit?
Well, that's the whole basis.
None of us do prachar, right? I mean, look, if I want to be difficult, I speak Sanskrit, and I'm fluent in it, right? Fluent in it, sorry. But not everybody speaks like that. Right?
And so, having something like that.
But putting a specific communal bent to it, to say, but look, you know, this is what they're taking away from us. It's a very dangerous thing.
But the whole basis of having that done is to promote diversity.
Multiculturalism, diversity, understanding, pluralism, tolerance. See, this is what I find funny. So we run and conduct all kinds of trainings. We speak all around the world, and, you know, we affirm these values. This country is full of human rights types, you know, self-selected moral entrepreneurs who give us philanthropy without democracy. But no one will speak out against any of these things at home. We passively watch. They're not just passively watching, they're actually legitimizing this discourse. They're giving credence to this discourse. I think to the politician who said, oh, but this is not Shuddh Hindi, we should really take this politician on and say, why are you linking that to religion?
Right.
And to our children and the schools. What are you doing? What are you doing with, you know, future voters of this country and the future of democracy?
We're just about to end this show. Mr. Raj, just one final question. Something that came up on islandbusiness.com on Saturday. The NFP inquiring about human rights. Dr. Biman Prasad, who is the leader of NFP, says that the public has a right to know why commissioners have not been appointed to oversee the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission.
He's absolutely incorrect in the sense that, you know, the commissioners were appointed a while back. And it was announced, it was all over the news. I think he needs to go back, look through the files, and he'll find out, like everybody else, that we have full set of commissioners, including a chairperson. They're very active. They're working very closely with the Human Rights Commission. So again, you know, I want to appeal to everybody's sense of reason. Please do not shoot your mouth, right, for the purposes of political expediency without finding the facts. You are really insulting the intelligence of people, right? People are far more astute than you think you know, they are. We have a public which is discerning, a public that reads, a public that knows what the facts are, and very soon you'll become a laughingstock of Fiji if you continue with this kind of rhetoric without the facts.
Mr. Raj, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you, in your role as Director of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, all the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have for you tonight.